Chapter 1. Nightmare begins. A frail-looking young man with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes was sitting on a rusty bench across from the police station. He was cradling a cup of coffee in his hands, not the cheap synthetic type slum rats like him had access to, but the real deal. This cup of plant-based coffee, usually available only to higher-rank citizens, had cost most of his savings. But on this particular day, Sonny decided to pamper himself. After all, his life was coming to an end. Enjoying the warmth of the luxurious drink, he raised the cup and savored the aroma. Then, tentatively, he took a small sip and immediately grimaced. Ah, so bitter. Giving the cup of coffee an intense look, Sonny sighed and forced himself to drink some more. Bitter or not, he was determined to get his money's worth. Taste buds be damned. I should have bought a piece of real meat instead. Who knew actual coffee is so disgusting? Well, it's going to keep me awake at least. He stared into the distance, dozing off, and then slapped himself in the face to wake up. What a rip-off! Shaking his head and cursing, Sonny finished the coffee and stood up. Rich people living in this part of the city were rushing past the small park on their way to work, staring at him with strange expressions, looking haggard in his cheap clothes and, from the lack of sleep, unhealthily thin and pale. Sonny was indeed out of his place here. Also, everyone seemed so tall. Watching them with a bit of envy, he tossed the cup into a garbage bin. I guess that's what 3 full meals a day would do to you. The cup missed the bin by a wide margin and fell on the ground. Sonny rolled his eyes in exasperation, walked over and picked it up before carefully putting it in the trash. Then, with a slight grin, he crossed the street and entered the police station. Inside, a tired-looking officer gave him a quick glance and frowned with obvious distaste. "Are you lost, boy?" Sonny looked around with curiosity, noting reinforced armor plates on the walls and poorly hidden turret nests in the ceiling. The officer, too, looked scruffy and mean. At least police stations remained the same wherever you go. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Sonny cleared his throat. No." Then he scratched the back of his head and added, "As demanded by the 3rd Special Directive, I am here to surrender myself as a carrier of the nightmare spell." The officer's expression instantly changed from irritated to wary. He looked the young man over once again, this time with piercing intensity. "Are you sure you are infected? When did you start showing symptoms?" Sonny shrugged. "A week ago." The officer became visibly paler. "Shit." Then, with a hurried motion, he pressed a button on his terminal and bellowed, "Attention! Code Black in the lobby. I repeat, COD Black." The nightmare spell first appeared in the world a few decades ago. Back then, the planet was just starting to recover from a series of devastating natural disasters and subsequent resource wars. At first, the emergence of a new disease that caused millions of people to complain about constant fatigue and sleepiness did not attract a lot of attention. But when they started to fall into an unnatural slumber, with no sign of waking up even days later, governments finally panicked. Of course, by then it was already too late. Not that an early response could have made any difference. When the infected started dying in their sleep, their dead bodies turning into monsters, no one was ready. Nightmare creatures quickly overwhelmed national militaries, plunging the world into complete chaos. No one knew what the spell was, what powers it possessed, and how to fight it. In the end, it was the awakened, those who survived the first trials of the spell and came back alive, who put a stop to its rampage. Armed with miraculous abilities earned in their nightmares, they restored peace and created a semblance of a new order. Of course, it was only the first of the catastrophes brought upon by the spell, but as far as Sonny was concerned, none of it had anything to do with him. Not until a few days ago, that is, when he first started having trouble with staying awake. For an average person, being chosen by the spell was as much of a risk as an opportunity. Kids learned survival skills and fighting techniques in school on the off chance of being infected. Well-to-do families hired private tutors to train their children in all sorts of martial arts. Those from the awakened clans even had access to powerful legacies, wielding inherited memories and echoes in their first visit to the dream realm. The richer your family was, the better your chances of surviving and becoming an awakened were. But for Sonny, who had no family to speak of and spent most of his time scrounging for food instead of going to school, being chosen by the spell presented no opportunity at all. To him, it was basically a death sentence. A few minutes later, Sonny was yawning while several policemen were busy putting him in restraints. Soon he was fastened into a bulky chair that looked like a weird mix between a hospital bed and a torture device. The room they were in was situated in the basement of the police station, with thick armored walls and a formidable-looking vault door. Other officers were standing near the walls with automatic rifles in their hands and grim expressions on their faces. Sonny did not particularly care about them. The only thing he could think about was how much he wanted to sleep. Finally, the vault door opened and a gray-haired policeman walked in. He had a seasoned face and stern eyes, looking like someone who had seen a lot of terrible things in his life. After checking the restraints, the policeman glanced quickly on his wristwatch and then turned to Sonny. "What's your name, kid?" Sonny blinked a few times, trying to concentrate, then shifted uncomfortably. "Sunless." The old policeman raised an eyebrow. "Sunless? That's a strange name." Sonny tried to shrug, but found himself unable to move. "What's so strange about it? At least I have a name. Back in the outskirts, not everyone even gets one." After another yawn, he added, "It's because I was born during a solar eclipse. My mum had a poetic soul, you see. That's why he got this weird-ass name, and his little sister was called Rain, back when she still lived with them, at least." Whether it was the result of poetic imagination or simple laziness, he did not know. The old policeman grunted. "Do you want me to contact your family?" Sonny simply shook his head. "There's no one. Don't bother." For a second, there was a dark look on the policeman's face. Then his expression turned serious. "All right, Sunless. How long can you stay awake?" Not long." The policeman sighed. "Then we don't have time for the full procedure. Try to resist for as long as you can and listen to me very carefully, okay?" Not waiting for a response, he added, "How much do you know about the nightmare spell?" Sonny gave him a questioning look. "As much as anyone, I guess. Who doesn't know about the spell? Not the fancy stuff you see in dramas and hear in the propaganda broadcasts. I mean, how much do you really know?" That was a hard question to answer. "Don't I just go into the dream realm, kill a few monsters to complete the first nightmare, receive magic powers, and become an awakened?" The old policeman shook his head. "Listen carefully. Once you fall asleep, you will be transported inside your first nightmare. Nightmares are trials created by the spell. Once inside, you will meet monsters, sure, but you will also meet people. Remember, they are not real. They're just illusions conjured up to test you." "How do you know?" The policeman just stared at him. "I mean, no one understands what the spell is and how it works, right? So how do you know that they're not real? You might have to kill them, kid, so do yourself a favor and just think about them as illusions." "Oh." The old policeman waited for a second, then nodded and continued. "A lot of things about the first nightmare depend on luck. Generally, it shouldn't be overwhelmingly hard. The situation you're in, the tools you have at your disposal, and the creatures you have to defeat should be within the range of your abilities at least. After all, the spell sets up trials, not executions. You're a bit disadvantaged due to, well, your circumstances, but kids from the outskirts are tough. Don't give up on yourself just yet." Sonny was getting more and more sleepy. It was becoming hard to follow the conversation. "About those magic powers you mentioned, you will indeed receive them if you survive until the end of the nightmare. What those powers will be exactly depends on your natural affinity as well what you do during the trial. but some of it will be at your disposal right from the start. The voice of the old policeman sounded more and more distant. Sonny's eyelids were so heavy that he was struggling to keep his eyes open. Remember, the first thing you must do once inside the nightmare is to check your attributes and your aspect. If you get a combat-oriented aspect, something like a swordsman or an archer, things will be easier. If it is reinforced by a physical attribute, then that's even better. Combat aspects are the most common, so the probability of receiving one is high. The armored room was growing dimmer. If you're unlucky and your aspect has nothing to do with combat, don't despair. Sorcery and utility aspects are useful in their own ways. You'll just have to be smart about it. There are really no useless aspects. Well, almost. So just do anything in your power to survive. If you survive, you will be halfway to becoming an awakened. But if you die, you'll open a gate for a nightmare creature to appear in the real world, which means that my colleagues and I will have to deal with it. So please don't die, Sunless. Already half asleep, Sunny felt a bit touched by the policeman's words. Or at least try to not die right away. The nearest awakened won't be able to get here for a few hours, so we would really appreciate it if you don't make us fight that thing ourselves. What? With that last thought, Sunny finally slipped into a deep slumber. Everything became black, and then, in the darkness, a faintly familiar voice rang. Aspirant, welcome to the nightmare spell. Prepare for your first trial. Chapter 2, Slave Caravan. Sunny dreamt of a mountain, jagged and lonesome. It dwarfed other peaks of the mountain chain, cutting the night sky with its sharp edges. A radiant moon bathed its slopes in the ghostly, pale light. On one of the slopes, the remnants of an old road stubbornly clung to the rocks. Here and there, weathered paved stones could be seen through the snow. To the right side of the road, a sheer cliff face rose as an impregnable wall. To the left, a silent black sea of nothingness indicated an endless fall. Strong winds crashed into the mountain over and over again, screaming in powerless rage. Suddenly, the moon fell over the horizon. The sun rose from the west, streaked across the sky, and disappeared in the east. Snowflakes jumped from the ground and returned into the embrace of clouds. Sunny realized that he was seeing the flow of time in reverse. In an instant, hundreds of years flew by. The snow retreated, bearing the old road. Cold shivers ran down Sunny's back as he noticed human bones littering the ground. A moment later, the bones were gone, and in their place, a slave caravan appeared, moving backwards down the mountain in the clamor of chains. Time slowed, stopped, and then resumed its usual pace. Aspirant, welcome to the nightmare spell. Prepare for your first trial. What the hell is this? Step. Step. Another step. A dull ache was radiating through Sunny's bleeding feet as he was shivering from cold. His threadbare tunic was nearly useless against the biting wind. His wrists were the main source of agony. Badly hurt by the iron shackles, they sent a sharp pang of pain every time the freezing metal touched his broken skin. What kind of a situation is this? Sunny looked up and down, noticing a long chain winding up the road, with dozens and dozens of hollow-eyed people, slaves just like him shackled to it at small intervals. Ahead of him, a man with broad shoulders and a bloodied back was walking with a measured gait. Behind him, a shifty-looking guy with quick, desperate eyes was quietly cursing under his breath in a language that Sunny did not know, but somehow still understood. From time to time, armed horsemen in ancient-style armor would pass by, giving the slaves menacing looks. However you judged it, things were really bad. Sunny was more bewildered than panicked. True, these circumstances were not like what the first nightmares were supposed to be. Usually, freshly chosen aspirants would find themselves in a scenario that presented them with a fair amount of agency. They would become members of privileged or warrior castes, with plenty of access to necessary weapons to at least try to tackle any conflict. Starting out as a powerless slave, shackled and already half dead, was as far from being ideal as one could imagine. However, the spell was as much about challenge as it was about balance. As the old policeman said, it created trials, not executions. So Sonny was pretty sure that to counter this abysmal start, it would reward him with something good. A powerful aspect, at least. Let's see. How do I do this? Remembering popular webtoons he read as a child, Sonny concentrated and thought about words like status, myself, and information. Indeed, as soon as he focused, shimmering runes appeared in the air in front of him. Once again, although he did not know this ancient alphabet, the meaning behind it was somehow clear. He quickly found the rune describing his aspect and, finally, lost his composure. What? What the actual fuck? Name. Sunless. True name. Mayen. Rank. Aspirant. Soulcore. Dormant. Memories. Natthi. Echoes. Attributes. Fated. Mark of divinity. Child of shadows. Aspect. Temple's slave. Aspect description. Slave is a useless wretch with no skills or abilities worth a mention. A temple slave is just the same except much rarer. Speechless, Sonny stared at the runes, trying to convince himself that he was maybe just seeing things. Surely he couldn't be that unlucky, right? No useless aspects, my ass. As soon as this thought appeared in his mind, he lost the rhythm of his steps and stumbled, pulling the chain down with his weight. Immediately, the shifty guy behind him screamed, "Whore's bastard! Watch where you're going." Sonny hurriedly dismissed the runes, which were only visible to him, and tried to recover his balance. A moment later, he was once again walking steadily, however, not before inadvertently pulling on the chain one more time. "You little shit! I'm going to kill you." The broad-shouldered man in front of Sonny chuckled without turning his head. "Why bother? The weakling will be dead by sunrise anyway. The mountain will kill him." A few seconds later, he added, "It'll kill you and me too, just a bit later. I really don't know what the Imperials are thinking, forcing us into this cold." The shifty guy gasped, "Speak for yourself, fool. I'm planning to survive." Sonny silently shook his head and concentrated on not falling again. What a charming pair. Suddenly, a third voice joined the conversation from somewhere further back. This one sounded gentle and intelligent. "This mountain pass is usually much warmer this time of year. We just had really bad luck. Also, I would advise you against harming this boy." "Why is that?" Sonny turned his head slightly, listening. "Haven't you seen the markings on his skin? He is not like us who fell into slavery due to debts, crimes, or misfortune. He was born a slave, a temple slave to be precise. Not long ago, the Imperials destroyed the last temple of the Shadow God. I suspect that this is how the boy ended up here." The broad-shouldered man cast a look back. "So what? Why should we be afraid of a half-forgotten weakling god? He couldn't even save his own temples. The Empire is protected by the mighty war god. Of course they're not afraid to burn down a few temples, but we here are not protected by anything or anyone. Do you really want to risk angering a god?" The broad-shouldered man grunted, not willing to answer. Their conversation was stopped by a young soldier riding a beautiful white horse, clad in a simple leather cuirass, armed with a spear and a short sword. He looked dignified and noble. To Sonny's irritation, the asshole was really pretty too. If this was a historical drama, the soldier would definitely be a male lead. "What is going on here?" There was no particular menace in his voice, even something resembling concern. When everyone hesitated, the gentle-voiced slave answered, "It's nothing, sir. We are just all tired and cold, especially our young friend over there. This journey is truly too hard for someone that young." The soldier looked at Sonny with pity. "What are you looking at? "You're not much older than me," Sonny thought. Of course, he didn't say anything out loud. The soldier sighed and took a flask from his belt before extending it to Sonny. "Bear with it a little more, child. We will stop for the night soon. For now, here, drink some water." "Child? Child?" Due to his thin body and small stature, both caused by malnourishment, Sonny was often mistaken for someone younger. Usually he didn't hesitate to use it to his advantage, but now, for some reason, being called a child really irked him. Still, he was really thirsty. He was just about to take the flask when a whip cracked in the air, and suddenly Sonny was in a world of pain. He stumbled, once again pulling on the chain and causing the shifty slave behind him to curse. Another soldier, this one older and angrier, stopped his horse a few steps back. The whip that sliced the back of Sonny's tunic open and drew blood belonged to him. Without even glancing at the slaves, the older soldier pierced his younger colleague with a disdainful glare. "What do you think you're doing?" The young soldier's face darkened. "I was just giving this boy some water. He'll receive water with the rest of them once we camp." "But shut your mouth. These slaves are not your friends. Understood? They're not even people. Treat them like people, and they'll begin imagining things." The young soldier looked at Sonny, then lowered his head and put the flask back on his belt. "Don't let me catch you making friends with slaves again, newbie, or next time it will be your back tasting my whip." As if to illustrate his intention, the older soldier cracked his whip in the air and rode past them, radiating threat and anger. Sonny watched him go with well-concealed malice. "I don't know how, but I will watch you die first." Then he turned his head and glanced in the direction of the younger soldier, who was falling behind with his head still lowered. "And you, second." Chapter 3. The Strings of Fate. For a few minutes after that, Sonny was in a dark mood. But then he pulled himself out of it and inhaled deeply, trying to enjoy the fresh air. Indeed, air like that was hard to come by in the real world. Microdust and other pollutants made it rough and unpleasant, not to mention the general stench of the outskirts. In the better parts of the city, sophisticated filtration systems worked diligently. However, filtrated air tasted sterile and stagnant. Only the very rich had access to truly pleasant breathing, and here he was, able to enjoy an unlimited amount of pristine, delicious air like a second-generation chaebol. Truly, being chosen by the spell has its benefits. If only there was no dreadful cold. His feet did not ache, and his wrists and back were not in agony. The slave caravan slowly dragged itself up the mountain, with more and more slaves stumbling and periodically falling to the ground. A couple of times, those who could not walk anymore were taken off the chain and unceremoniously tossed off the road, down into the abyss that loomed to the left of it. Sonny watched them fall with a bit of compassion. Poor fellows. Rest in peace, you pitiful souls. All in all, he was in good spirits. It was a bit strange to feel good amidst this disaster of a nightmare, but thankfully Sonny had time to prepare himself for this eventuality. When the symptoms of the spell first appeared, he did not handle it well. Dying before you even turned 17 was not something one could easily cope with. But, in the end, it only took Sonny several days to come to terms with it. After visiting his parents' makeshift resting place, well, actually, since he was too poor to afford even the cheapest slot in the remembrance facility, it was just 2 lines carved into an old tree, and adding a third line for himself, Sonny suddenly became relaxed and carefree. After all, he didn't have to worry about earning money, finding food, protecting himself, and planning for the future anymore. Once the worst that could happen had already happened, what else was there to fear? So, becoming a slave and slowly freezing to death was not that much of a shock. Besides, he knew that cold would not kill him, simply because he had already seen what fate was awaiting the caravan further up the mountain. The picture of piled bones littering the ground was still fresh in his mind. Most likely, it was a pack of monsters that were going to do the caravan in, and by the look of it, The attack was going to take place in a matter of hours, not days, so he still had a chance. Using the opportunity, Sonny decided to take another look at his status and summoned the runes again. The last time he was too outraged by the aspect and didn't study the attributes well. While not as important as one's aspect, the attributes were often the deciding factor between life and death. They represented one's natural traits and affinities, sometimes even providing passive abilities and effects. Fated attribute description. The strings of fate wrap tightly around you. Unlikely events, both good and bad, are drawn by your presence. There are those who are blessed, and there are those who are cursed, but rarely both. Mark of divinity attribute description. You bear a faint scent of divinity, as though someone briefly touched by it once, a long time ago. Child of shadows attribute description. Shadows recognize you as one of their own. Interesting. Sonny quickly recognized the first attribute, fated, as the main culprit of his predicament. At first glance, it seemed to indicate that he was destined for a certain fate, to die miserably and vanish without a trace, for example. But after reading the description, he realized that being fated actually just meant that improbable things had a higher chance of occurring when he was around. I guess this is how I managed to receive one of the super rare, useless aspects, and a weird variant of it at that. If fated was his innate attribute, then the other two came from the temple slave aspect. Mark of divinity was more or less straightforward. It was supposed to allow passage into certain sacred places inside the dream realm and enhance several types of sorcery. Since there were no sacred places in sight, and Sonny's aspect had nothing to do with sorcery, it was useless too. Child of Shadows was a stranger one. He had never heard of it and had no idea what it was supposed to do, at least not until the sun hid behind the mountain and the sky began to darken. To his surprise, Sonny found himself able to see perfectly in the darkness, as though it was still as bright as day. This ability alone was nothing to scoff at, and it was quite possible that Shadows would reward him with some other yet unknown gifts. Finally, something good. I wonder if... Stop the caravan, prepare to camp. Following the head soldier's order, the slaves stopped and fell to the ground, shivering and exhausted. The small clearing where the road widened was somewhat protected from the wind by a protruding mass of rock, but it was still too cold to rest with ease. The soldiers got busy herding the slaves into a tight circle, forcing them to share warmth, and lighting up a large bonfire in the center of the camp, although not before tending to their horses. The heavy wagon carrying food, water, and other cargo, to which the main chain was firmly affixed, was pushed forward to block the wind. While looking around, Sonny noticed the young soldier from before watching the mountain with a complicated look on his face. What a weirdo! Soon the bonfire was blazing. The stronger slaves tried to find their way closer to the fire, while the weaker ones, like Sonny, were forced to sit at the outer end of the circle, with their backs freezing in the cold. Of course, any movement was encumbered by the fact that they were still shackled to the chain. That's why the familiar broad-shouldered slave ended up just where he started despite all of his efforts to get closer to the flame. "Damn Imperials," he hissed, clearly irritated. The soldiers walked among the slaves, giving them water and food. Sonny, just like everybody else, received a few sips of icy water and a small piece of rock-hard, moldy bread. Despite its unappetizing look, he forced himself to eat the whole thing, just to be left as hungry as he was before. By the looks of it, he wasn't the only one. The shifty slave that had been walking behind him looked around in anguish. "By all the gods, they used to feed me better even in the dungeons." He spat on the ground, desperate, and most of us innocent men in the dungeon were there waiting to visit the gallows too. A few steps away from them, where the paved road ended and sharp rocks began, a scattering of bright red berries were growing from the snow. Sonny had noticed them before, clustering here and there along the road, and even noted how pretty those resilient things looked contrasted against the white. The shifty slave's eyes glistened as he tried to crawl towards the berries on all fours. "I would advise against eating those, friend." It was the gentle-voiced slave again. Sonny turned around and finally saw him in the flesh for the first time. It was a tall man in his 40s, lean and strangely handsome, with a dignified look of a scholar. How a man such as him ended up a slave was a mystery. Yet there he was. "You and your advice again. What? Why?" The scholar smiled apologetically. "These berries are called bloodbane. They grow in the places where human blood was spilled. That's why there's always a lot of them along the slave trade routes." "So what?" The older man sighed. "Bloodbane is poisonous. A few berries might be enough to kill an adult man." "Curses!" The shifty slave flinched back and glared at the scholar. Sonny did not pay them a lot of attention, because while looking around, he finally recognized the site of the camp as the place where, in his vision at the start of the nightmare, the bones of the slaves were buried under the snow. And he was willing to bet that whatever it was that killed them all was going to happen soon. As if to answer his thoughts, a thundering noise rang from above, and in the next second, something massive came crashing from the sky. Chapter 4. Mountain King. Turning in the direction of the thundering noise, many slaves rose their heads, only to see rocks and heavy shards of ice raining on them from above. They instantly panicked, lurching away in a cacophony of screams. Shadows happily danced on black stones as, entangled by the thick chain, those slaves fell to the ground and pulled others with them. Sonny was one of the few that remained upright, mostly because he was ready for something like this to happen. Calm and collected, he gazed at the night sky, his attribute-enhanced eyes piercing the darkness, and took one measured step back. In the next second, a piece of ice the size of a man's torso hit the ground right in front of him and exploded, showering everything around with sharp shards. Others weren't that quick. As ice and stones continued to rain, many were wounded, and a few even lost their lives. Agonizing wails filled the air. "On your feet, fools! Get to the wall!" The veteran soldier, the one who had whipped Sonny a few hours before, was shouting angrily, trying to get the slaves to move towards the relative safety of the mountain slope. However, before anyone could heed his command, something massive came crashing down, sending a tremor through the stones beneath their feet. It fell right between the caravan and the mountain wall, plunging everything into silence for a few seconds. At first, it looked like a lump of dirty snow, roughly round in shape and as tall as a mounted horseman. However, once the creature unfurled its long limbs and rose, it towered over the stone platform like a nightmarish omen of death. "That thing must be at least 4 meters tall," Sonny thought, a bit stunned. The creature had 2 stumpy legs, an emaciated, hunched torso, and disproportionately long, multi-jointed hands, 2 of them, each ending with a set of horrifying bone claws, and another 2, these ones shorter, ending with almost human-like fingers. The thing that at first glance looked like dirty snow turned out to be its fur, yellowish-gray and ragged, thick enough to stop arrows and swords. On its head, 5 milky white eyes regarded the slaves with insect-like indifference. Beneath them, a terrible maw crowding with razor-sharp teeth was half open, as though in anticipation. Viscous drool was running down the creature's chin and dripping into the snow. What unnerved Sonny the most, though, were the strange shapes endlessly moving, worm-like, under the creature's skin. He could see them clearly because, unfortunately, he was one of those unlucky souls closest to the monstrosity, getting a nauseating first-row view. "Well, that is just too much," he thought, stupefied. As soon as Sonny finished that thought, all hell broke loose. The creature moved, slashing its claws in his general direction. But Sonny was one step ahead. Without wasting a single moment, he jumped sideways as far as the chain allowed, conveniently placing the broad-shouldered slave between himself and the monster. His quick reaction saved his life, as those sharp claws, each as long as a sword, sliced through the broad-shouldered man a fraction of a second later and sent streams of blood flying through the air. Drenched in the hot liquid, Sonny hit the ground, and his fellow slave, now simply a corpse, fell on him from above. "Damn! Why are you so heavy?" Temporarily blinded, Sonny heard a chilling howl and felt an enormous shadow passing over him. Immediately after, a deafening chorus of screams filled the night. Not paying it any attention, he tried to roll the corpse to the side, but was stopped by a forceful lurch of the chain that twisted his wrists and filled his mind with white-hot pain. Disoriented, he felt himself being dragged a few steps, but then the chain suddenly slackened and he was able to control his hands again. See, things could have been worse. Putting his palms against the dead man's chest, he pushed with all the strength he had. The heavy corpse stubbornly resisted all his attempts, but then finally fell sideways, setting Sonny free. However, he didn't get to celebrate this newly found freedom, as his blood suddenly turned to ice, because at that moment, with his palms still pressed against the broad-shouldered slave's bleeding body, he clearly felt something wriggling under the dead man's skin. "You just had to think about how things could get worse, right, you idiot?" he thought, and then flinched back. Pushing the corpse with his legs, Sonny crawled as far away from it as he could, which was about 1.5 meters, thanks to the ever-present chain. He quickly glanced around, noticing a mass of dancing shadows and the silhouette of the monster rampaging amidst the screaming slaves on the opposite end of the stone platform. Then he concentrated on the dead body, which was starting to convulse with growing violence. On the opposite side of the corpse, the shifty slave was looking at it with slackened jaw and a horrified expression on his face. Sonny waved to get his attention. "What are you staring at? Move away from it." The shifty slave tried, but immediately fell down. The chain was twisted between the three of them, pinned down under by the broad-shouldered man's weight. Sonny clenched his teeth. Right under his eyes, the corpse was going through a nightmare-inducing metamorphose. Strange bone growths pierced its skin, extending like spikes. The muscles bulged and wriggled as though trying to change shape. The fingernails were turning into sharp claws. The face cracked and split, bearing open a twisted mouth with one too many rows of bloodied, needle-like fangs. "This is not right." Sonny twitched, feeling a strong urge to empty his stomach. The chain." The scholarly slave was just a few steps behind the shifty one, pointing at his shackles with a face as pale as a ghost. That remark was far from helpful, but given the circumstances, his shock was understandable. Being shackled was bad enough, but being shackled to such horror was truly unfair. But Sonny's conclusion that things weren't right did not come from self-pity. He just meant that this whole situation was literally not right. The spell, mysterious as it was, had its own set of rules. There were rules for what type of creatures could appear in any given nightmare, too. Nightmare creatures had their own hierarchy, from mindless beasts to monsters, followed by demons, devils, tyrants, terrors, and, finally, mythical titans, also known as calamities. The first nightmare was almost always populated by beasts and monsters, rarely with a demon mixed in. And Sonny had never ever heard about anything stronger than a single devil appearing in it. However, the creature had clearly just created a lesser version of itself, an ability that belonged exclusively to tyrants, the sovereigns of the nightmare spell, and those above them. What was this tyrant even doing in a first nightmare? How powerful was that damn fated attribute? But there was no time to ponder. Unfair or not, there was only one person now who could save Sonny, himself. The broad-shouldered man, what was left of him, slowly rose, his mouth producing strange clicking noises. Without giving him time to fully come to his senses, Sonny cursed and jumped forward, grabbing onto the length of the slackened chain. One arm of the monster, now fully equipped with 5 jagged claws, shot forward to meet him, but Sonny sidestepped it with one calculated movement. What saved his skin this time was not quick reaction, but simple presence of mind. Sonny might not have learned any fancy combat techniques, since his childhood was spent on the streets instead of a school, but the streets, too, were a kind of teacher. He had spent his whole life fighting for survival, quite often literally. That experience allowed him to keep a cool head on his shoulders in the midst of any conflict. So instead of freezing or being consumed by fear and doubt, Sonny just acted. Stepping close, he threw the chain around the monster's shoulders and pulled, pinning its hands to its body. Before the creature, still slow and groggy from its transformation, could properly react, Sonny wrapped the chain around it several times, barely saving his face from being bitten off by the creature's terrifying maw. The good thing was, the monster couldn't move its hands now. The bad thing was, the length of the chain he used to immobilize it was gone, leaving almost no distance between them. "You two," Sonny screamed, addressing his 2 fellow slaves. "Pull on that chain as though your lives depend on it." Because they were. The shifty slave and the scholar gaped at him, and then, understanding what he was thinking, started to move. Grabbing the chain from the opposite directions, they pulled as hard as they could, tightening its grip on the monster and not letting it shake loose. Great, Sonny thought. The monster bulged its muscles, trying to break free. The chain creaked, caught on the bone spikes, as though slowly breaking apart. Not so great! Without wasting any more time, he threw his hands in the air and caught the creature's neck with the short, thinner chain connecting his shackles together. Then he circled the monster with a quick step and pulled, ending up back to back with it, as far away from its maw as he could. Sonny knew that he wasn't strong enough to strangle a man with his bare hands, let alone a weird, terrifying mutant like the one trying to eat him. But now, using his own back as a lever and the weight of his whole body to pull the shackles down, he at least stood a chance. He pulled down with all his might, feeling the monster's body pressing against him, bone spikes brushing against his skin. The monster continued to struggle, clicking loudly and trying to break the chain tying him down apart. Now it was just a question of what would break first, the chain or the monster itself. Die! Die, you bastard! Sweat and blood were rolling down Sonny's face as he was pulling, and pulling, and pulling down with as much force as he could muster. Every second felt like an eternity. His strength and stamina, what little he had to begin with, were quickly running out. His wounded back, wrists, and muscles pierced by the bone spikes were in agony. And then, finally, Sonny felt the monster's body go limp. A moment later, a faintly familiar voice rang in the air. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "You have slain a dormant beast, Mountain King's larva." Chapter 5, Broken Chains. "You have slain a dormant beast, Mountain King's larva." Sonny fell to his knees, breathless. His whole body felt as though it just went through a meat grinder. Even large amounts of adrenaline could not wash away all the pain and exhaustion. And yet he was exhilarated. The satisfaction of killing the larva was so vast that he even forgot to be disappointed about not receiving a memory, the special item tied to a dream realm inhabitant's essence, which was sometimes awarded by the spell to the triumphant awakened. A magic sword or a suit of armor would have come in handy right about now. Damn, he would even settle for a warm coat. 3 seconds. You can rest for 3 more seconds, Sonny thought. After all, the nightmare was far from over. A few moments later, he forced himself to come back to his senses and looked around, trying to ascertain the situation. The larva was dead, which was great. However, he was still tied to it by the damned chain. The shifty slave and the scholar, both pale as death, were busy untangling it to buy the 3 of them at least some freedom of movement. Further away, torn bodies and pieces of flesh were lying on the ground. Many slaves were killed. A few had somehow managed to escape and were now running away. Fools. They're dooming themselves. The chain, as it turns out, was at some point broken in two. That's why it suddenly slackened when Sonny was being dragged by the mass of panicking slaves. If their shackles had a less sophisticated locking mechanism, he could have tried to free himself now. However, each pair was fixed to a specific link. Without unlocking them, no one was going anywhere. The Tyrant, Mountain King presumably, was hidden from sight by the bright glow of the bonfire. However, Sonny could feel its movements due to the subtle tremors spreading through the stones, as well as the desperate screams of those slaves who were yet to perish. An angry bellow or two could also be heard, indicating that some of the soldiers were still alive, desperately trying to fight the monstrosity off. What pulled his attention the most, though, was the fact that several of the maimed bodies were starting to move. More larvae? His eyes widened. One after another, 4 more corpses slowly rose to their feet. Each beast looked as disgusting as the first one had, and not a bit less deadly. The nearest was mere meters away from Sonny. Damn it all, he thought, and then weakly, I want to wake up. As strange clicking filled the air, one of the beasts turned its head toward the 3 slaves and gnashed its fangs. Shifty fell on his ass, whispering a prayer, while Scholar just froze in place. Sonny's eyes darted to the ground, trying to find something to use as a weapon, but there was not a single thing he could use. Full of vitriol, he simply wrapped a length of chain around the knuckles and raised his fists. Come at me, you bastard! The larva dashed forward with incredible speed in a flurry of claws, fangs, and terror. Sonny had less than a second to react. However, before he could do anything, a nimble figure moved past him, and a sharp sword flashed in the air. The monster, beheaded with one strike, fell gracelessly onto the ground. Sonny blinked. What was that? Dumbfounded, he slowly turned his head and looked to his left. Standing there with a valorous expression was the handsome young soldier who had once offered him water. He looked calm and collected, if a little grim. There was not a speck of dirt or blood on his leather armor. He is awesome, Sonny thought before catching himself. Poser? I mean, he's a poser. With a short nod, the soldier moved forward to face the remaining 3 larvae. But after taking a few steps, he suddenly turned around and gave Sonny a long look. Then, with one swift motion, the young warrior took something from his belt and threw it to Sonny. Save yourself. With that, he was gone to fight the monsters. Sonny reflexively caught the item and watched the soldier go. Then he lowered his gaze and studied the thing clutched tightly in his hand. It was a short and narrow iron rod with a straight bend on its end. A key. It's a key. His heart began to beat faster. It's the key to the shackles. With one last glance at the fierce battle starting between the young soldier and the larvae, Sonny dropped on one knee and began to maneuver the shackles, trying to get his hand into a suitable position to insert the key. It took him a few tries to understand how the unfamiliar lock worked, but then, finally, there was a satisfying click, and he was suddenly free. The cold wind caressed his bloodied wrists. Sonny rubbed them and smiled with a dark gleam in his eyes. Just you wait now. For a moment, visions of violence and revenge filled his head. Boy, over here! Shifty was waving his hands in the air, trying to get his attention. Sonny briefly considered just leaving him to die, but then decided against it. There was strength in numbers. Plus, despite Shifty's previous threats to kill him and overall unpleasantness, Sonny would have felt bad leaving a fellow slave in chains, especially since freeing him would not cost anything. He hurried over to the other 2 slaves and quickly unlocked their shackles. As soon as Shifty was free, he pushed Sonny away and did a little dance, laughing like a maniac. Ah, free at last. Gods must be smiling upon us. Scholar was more reserved. He squeezed Sonny's shoulder in gratitude and smiled weakly, casting a tense look in the direction of the ensuing fight. 2 of the 3 larvae were already dead. The third one was missing an arm but still trying to tear its opponent apart. The young soldier danced around it, moving with a graceful fluidity of a natural-born warrior. "What are you waiting for? Run!" Shifty made a move to run away but was stopped by Scholar. "My friend, I would—" "If you say advise again, I swear to gods, I will bash your head open." The two slaves looked at each other with open animosity. A moment later, Scholar lowered his eyes and sighed. "If we run away now, we will surely die." "Why?" The older slave simply pointed at the tall bonfire. "Because without that fire, we will freeze to death before the night is over. Until the sun rises, running away is suicide." Sonny did not say anything, knowing that Scholar was right. Actually, he realized it right after strangling the larva. No matter how terrible Mountain King was, the bonfire was still their only lifeline in this frozen hell. It was just as what the broad-shouldered slave, may he rest in peace, had said. There was no need for anyone to kill them, because the mountain itself would do it if given a chance. So what? I prefer freezing to death than being eaten by that monster anyway. Not to mention, turning into one of those things. Shifty was pretending to be brave, but there was no conviction in his voice. He glanced at the darkness surrounding the stone platform and shivered before taking a small step back. At this point, the third larva was long dead, and the young soldier was nowhere to be seen. He had probably gone to join the fight at the other side of the bonfire, leaving the three slaves alone at the mountainside part of the stone platform. Scholar cleared his throat. The monster might be satiated with those it had already slain. It might be defeated or driven away by the Imperials. In any case, if we stay here, we have a chance to survive, however small. But if we run away, our doom will be certain. So what do we do? Unlike Scholar, Sonny was sure that Mountain King would not be satisfied with killing just most of the slaves. Neither did he believe that a bunch of mortals would really be able to defeat it, even if they were not normal people but awakened. A fight with a tyrant was not something one could easily survive, let alone win. But if he wanted to live, he had to get rid of that thing somehow. "Let's go take a look." Shifty looked at him as though seeing a lunatic. "Are you insane? You want to get closer to that beast?" Sonny stared at him blankly, then shrugged and headed in the direction of the rampaging monster. Chapter 6. Confronting the Tyrant. Sonny was off to face against a nightmare creature. And not any creature at that, but one of the fifth category, a dreaded, fearsome tyrant. The odds of survival were so low that anyone would have laughed in his face if he were to ever suggest attempting to fight it. If they weren't an awakened 2 or 3 ranks above the creature, of course, which Sonny certainly wasn't. And yet he had to deal with this Mountain King somehow to avoid an even more miserable death. The ridiculous degree to which the odds were stacked against him from the very beginning of this delayed execution had gotten old a long time ago, so he didn't have any more energy to think about it. What was there to fear, after all? He was already as good as dead. It's not like he could get any deader, so why worry? On the other side of the bonfire, things were turning from bad to worse. Most of the slaves were already dead. A few soldiers were still desperately trying to fight the monster, but it was clear that they weren't going to last long. Right in front of Sonny's eyes, the tyrant picked up a dead slave, dragging the chain up with him, and opened its terrifying maw wide. With one crushing bite, the slave's body was torn in half, leaving only bloodied stumps inside the shackles. Mountain King's 5 indifferent, milky eyes stared into the distance as he chewed, streams of blood flowing down its chin. Seeing that the creature's upper arms were busy, one of the soldiers screamed and lunged forward, brandishing his long spear. Without turning its head, the tyrant extended one of its shorter lower arms, caught the soldier's head in an iron grip and squeezed, crushing the poor man's skull like a soap bubble. A moment later, the headless body was tossed over the cliff and disappeared into the abyss below. Shifty doubled over, puking his guts out. Then he shakily rose to his feet and glared at Sonny. "Well, we've taken a look, now what?" Sonny did not answer, pensively observing the tyrant with his head slightly tilted to one side. Shifty stared at him some more, then turned to Scholar. "I'm telling you, old man, the boy is sick in the head. How the hell can he be so calm?" "Sheesh. Lower your voice, fool." Blood drained from Shifty's face as he slapped himself, covering his mouth with both hands. Then he cast a fearful look in the direction of the tyrant. Luckily, the abomination was too busy feasting on the slaves, lucky ones who were already dead and unlucky ones who were still alive, to pay them any attention. Shifty slowly exhaled. Sonny was preoccupied with thinking, measuring his chances of survival. How do I get rid of that thing? He didn't have any special powers, nor did he have an army ready to bury the tyrant under a mountain of bodies. He didn't even have a weapon to at least scratch the damn bastard. Sonny moved his gaze and looked past the creature into the endless darkness of the moonless sky. As he was watching the night, a bright flash streaked in the air and collided with one of the tyrant's arms, bursting into a rain of sparks. The young soldier, Sonny's heroic liberator, had just tossed a burning piece of wood at the monster and was now defiantly raising his sword. "Face me, devil!" A distraction. Just what I needed, because there was no way for Sonny to kill the Mountain King with his own two hands. He had decided to enlist some help. A human wouldn't be up to the task, so instead he was planning to use a force of nature. Since I can't do the bastard in myself, let's make gravity do it for me. He was in the middle of thinking over the details of the plan when the young hero's foolish bravado presented an opportunity. Now everything depended on how long the pompous idiot would manage to stay alive. "Come with me," Sonny said as he started running toward the far end of the stone platform, where the heavy wagon was perched dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. Shifty and Scholar shared a dubious look, but then followed, perhaps confusing his calmness with confidence or maybe divine inspiration. After all, it was a widely known fact that crazy people were often favored by the gods. Behind them, Hero nimbly ducked under the tyrant's claws, slashing it with the sword. The sharp edge slid ineffectively across the dirty fur, not leaving even a scratch on the creature's flesh. In the next second, the tyrant moved with frightening speed, throwing all four of his hands in the direction of its new, irritating foe. But Sonny had no way of knowing. He was running with all his speed, getting closer and closer to the wagon. Once there, he hurriedly looked around, checking if there were any larvae close by, and moved to its rear wheels. The wagon was left at the upper end of the stone platform, where it narrowed and turned back into the road. It was turned sideways to block the wind, with its front facing the mountain wall and its back facing the cliff. There were two large wooden wedges placed under the rear wheels to prevent the wagon from rolling backward. Sonny turned to his companions and pointed at the wedges. "When I tell you, remove both of them, then push. Understand?" "What? Why?" Shifty stared at him with a dumbfounded expression on his face. Scholar just looked at the wedges and then at the tyrant. Hero, miraculously, was still alive. He was weaving between the creature's limbs, always just half a second away from being completely eviscerated. From time to time, his sword flashed in the air, but to no avail. Mountain King's fur was too thick, and his skin too tough to be harmed by mundane weapons. There was a hint of apprehension on the young warrior's face. All the other soldiers, as far as Sonny could see, were already dead. So he really needed that one to live a little bit longer. "Don't die yet," he thought. To Shifty, he simply said, "You'll see." The next moment, Sonny was running again, trying to follow the chain from the brace where it was affixed to the wagon. The thing he was searching for was hard to notice due to all the bodies, blood and viscera littering the stone platform, but for once, luck was on his side. A short amount of time later, he had found what he needed, the torn end of the chain. Finding the nearest set of shackles, complete with the horribly disfigured body of a slave locked in them. Sonny plopped down on his knees and started to fumble with the key. There was a muffled scream, and with a sideways glance he noticed Hero flying through the air, finally caught by one of the tyrant's strikes. Incredibly, the young soldier managed to land on his feet, sliding several meters across the stones. All of his limbs were still in place. There were no terrible wounds on his body either. Without skipping a bit, Hero rolled forward, picking up his sword from where it fell on the ground, and then rolled once more, this time sideways, narrowly avoiding a heavy stomp from the creature's foot. Rolling? Who the hell rolls around in this situation? Without any more time to waste, Sonny finally managed to unlock the shackles. Shaking the dead slave out of them, he then promptly locked them once again, this time around the chain itself, ending up with a makeshift slipknot and a loop. Now everything depended on his resolve, hand-to-eye coordination, and luck. Turning to Shifty and Scholar, who were still waiting by the wagon, he screamed, "Now!" Then, picking up a sizable length of chain, Sonny stood up and faced the tyrant. Hero spared him half a glance. His eyes lingered on the chain for a moment, and then quickly followed it to the wagon. Then, without showing a hint of emotion, the young warrior doubled his efforts, drawing the creature's attention away from Sonny. So he's smart, too? What a scam! Clearing his head of all unnecessary thoughts, Sonny concentrated on the weight of the chain in his hands, the distance between him and the tyrant, and his target. Time seemed to slow down a bit. "Please, don't miss." Gathering all of his strength, Sonny spun and threw the chain in the air, as though a fisherman casting his net. The loop opened as it flew, closing in on the position of the fight between Hero and the tyrant. Sonny's plan was to place the loop on the ground close enough to them that, once one of the tyrant's feet landed in the trap, he could pull on the chain and tighten it around the monster's ankle. But his plan failed spectacularly, which is to say it was literally a spectacle. In the last moment, Mountain King suddenly flinched back, and instead of falling on the ground, the chain loop landed perfectly around its neck. A second later it tightened, acting as an iron noose. Sonny froze for a moment, not believing his eyes, and then clenched his fists, holding himself back from triumphantly shaking them in the air. "Yes!" he screamed inwardly. Moments later, the wagon would roll off the cliff, pulling the tyrant down with it. Sonny looked back to make sure, and instantly turned even paler than he usually was. Shifty and Scholar did manage to remove the wedges from under the wagon's wheels, and were now desperately pushing it to the edge of the road. However, the wagon was rolling slowly, very slowly, much slower than Sonny had anticipated. He turned to the tyrant, panicking. The creature, surprised by the sudden weight pressing down on its neck, was already raising its hands to tear the chain apart. Sonny's eyes widened. In the next second, Hero crashed into one of the tyrant's legs, throwing it off balance and buying them some time. Sonny was already running to the wagon, cursing loudly in his mind. Reaching it, he threw himself onto the damp wood alongside Shifty and Scholar, pushing with all the strength left in his rather small, but terribly beaten and enormously exhausted body. "Roll! Roll, you creaky piece of shit!" The wagon sped up a little, but was still rather slow in reaching the cliff's edge. At the same time, the tyrant finally managed to get a hold of the chain tied around its neck, ready to free itself. Now, whether they lived or not was just a question of which thing would happen first. Chapter 7. 3 Slaves and a Hero. "Roll, you creaky piece of shit." Sonny pressed himself against the wagon, pushing with all he had. 4 powerful oxen that used to pull it were now dead, and instead of them, 3 tired slaves were trying to do the job. Even with the slope of the road helping them, the speed of the wagon was agonizingly slow. The tyrant, in comparison, was moving much faster. Pushing Hero back with a deadly swipe of his lower arms, he raised the other 2 to its neck and tried to grab the chain that was wrapped around it like a noose. However, this time Mountain King's fearsome physique turned into a disadvantage. Its long, terrifying bone claws were perfect for tearing flesh apart, but they weren't the best tool for precise manipulations. It took the tyrant some time to get a hold of the chain without slicing its own neck open. By then, the wagon was nearly at the edge of the cliff. "Come on, just a little bit more." What followed happened very quickly. The wagon's rear wheels finally slid from the road, hanging over the dark, seemingly bottomless pit beneath. The creature turned, staring expressionlessly at the three slaves with its 5 milky, dead eyes. The wagon careened, throwing Shifty and Scholar off their feet, and then froze, balanced precariously on its middle axis. Sonny was the only one left standing. He cast a last glance at the towering monster, and then slammed his shoulder into the front of the wagon, putting all of his weight behind it. The wagon finally lost its balance and rolled over the edge, scraping its underside deafeningly against the jagged rocks. Sonny fell forward and landed on his knees, narrowly saving himself from tumbling down the cliff with it. Turning his head to the tyrant, he gave it a wicked smile. Mountain King made a move to lunge at the scrawny slave, but it was already too late. A moment later, the chain on his neck drew tight, and he was yanked back with tremendous force, flying over the edge of the cliff like a rag doll. The creature fell into the darkness silently, as though refusing to believe that it was defeated by a tiny human. "Go and die, bastard," Sonny thought. Then he took one deep, ragged breath and dropped to the ground, utterly exhausted. "Is this it? Did I pass the trial?" He rested on the cold stones, staring at the night sky, and waited for that faintly familiar but elusive voice to announce his victory. But instead of that, wave after wave of pain that he had earlier chosen to ignore finally started to catch up with his abused body. Sonny groaned, feeling hurt all over. The skin on his back, slashed by a slaver's whip and pierced by the bone spikes of a newborn larva especially, was in agony. He was also starting to shiver, once again consumed by the dreadful cold. "I guess not." His thoughts were slow and muddy. "What else am I supposed to do?" A dark figure appeared above him. It was Hero, looking calm and as handsome as ever. There were dirt and scratches on his armor, but otherwise the young soldier appeared to be fine. He extended one arm to Sonny. "Stand up, you'll freeze to death." Sonny sighed, accepting that his first nightmare was not over. Then he clenched his teeth and slowly rose to his feet, ignoring Hero's helping hand. Around them there was a scene of utter carnage. Except for the 3 slaves and Hero, every member of the caravan was dead. Their bodies were littering the ground, horribly maimed or torn into pieces. Here and there, a repulsive carcass of a larva could be seen. Shadows cast by the bonfire were dancing happily across the stone platform, seemingly unperturbed by this morbid view. Sonny was also too tired to care. Shifty and Scholar were already up, looking at Hero with weary apprehension. With or without shackles, they were still slaves, and he was still a slave driver. Noticing their tense gazes, the soldier sighed. "Come closer to the fire, all of you. We need to warm ourselves and discuss what to do next." Without waiting for their response, Hero turned around and walked away. After hesitating for a few moments, the slaves followed. A bit of time later, the 4 of them were seated around the bonfire, soaking up pleasant heat. Shifty and Scholar were close to each other, maintaining a safe distance from Hero. Sonny sat apart from everyone, not because he had a specific reason to distrust one more than the others, but simply because he didn't like people in general. Growing up, Sonny was always a misfit. It's not that he had never tried to become close with someone, it's just that he seemed to lack the ability, like there was an invisible wall between him and other people. If he had to put it in words, Sonny would say that he was born without a small but important gear in his brain that everyone else seemed to possess. As a result, he was often baffled and stumped by human behavior, and his attempts to imitate it, however diligent, inevitably fell flat. This strangeness made others uncomfortable. In short, he was a bit different, and if there was one thing people hated, it was those different from them. Over time, Sonny simply learned to avoid getting too close to anyone and settled comfortably into his outcast role. This habit served him well, since it not only made him self-reliant, but also saved him from being stabbed in the back by shady characters on multiple occasions. That's why he was not thrilled to share the rest of this nightmare with three strangers. Instead of trying to start a conversation, Sonny sat quietly by himself, lost in thoughts. After a few minutes, Hero's voice finally broke the silence. "Once the sun rises, we will gather whatever food and water we can find and go back down the mountain." Shifty gave him a defiant look. "Why should we go back? To be put in chains again?" The young soldier sighed. "We can go our separate ways once we leave the mountains, but until then, I'm still responsible for your lives. We can't continue up the road since the way over the mountain pass is long and arduous. Without the supplies that were stored on the wagon, your chances of making it are not high. That's why going back is our best hope." Scholar opened his mouth, planning to say something, but then thought better of it and remained silent. Shifty cursed, seemingly convinced by Hero's rational words. "We can't go down." All three of them turned to Sonny, surprised to hear his voice. Shifty barked a laugh and glanced at the soldier. "Don't listen to him, your lordship. This boy is, touched by the gods. He's crazy is what I'm trying to say." Hero frowned, looking at the slaves. "The two of you are only alive thanks to this child's bravery. Aren't you ashamed to badmouth him so?" Shifty shrugged, showing that he wasn't ashamed at all. The young soldier shook his head. "I, for one, would like to hear his reasoning. Tell me, why can't we go down?" Sonny shifted, uncomfortable in the center of everyone's attention. "Because the monster isn't dead." Chapter 8. Nothing at all. Because the monster isn't dead. These ominous words hung in the silence. Three pairs of eyes widened, staring right at Sonny. "Why do you say that?" After thinking about it, Sonny came to the conclusion that the tyrant was indeed still alive. His reasoning was pretty straightforward. He did not hear the spell congratulating him on slaying the creature after it fell off the cliff, which meant that it was not slain. But he couldn't explain that to his companions. He pointed up. The monster jumped from an incredible height to land on this platform, yet it wasn't harmed at all. Why would it be killed by falling off the platform? Neither Hero nor the slaves could find a flaw in his argument. Sonny continued, "Which means that it's still alive, somewhere down the mountain, so by going back we will be delivering ourselves into its maw." Shifty cursed loudly and crawled closer to the bonfire, staring into the darkness with terror in his eyes. Scholar rubbed his temples, mumbling, "Of course. Why didn't I realize myself?" Hero was the most stoic of the three. After thinking it over, he nodded. "Then we go up and over the mountain pass. But that's not all." He glanced in the direction where the tyrant had fallen. "If the monster is still alive, there is a high possibility that it will return here and then pursue us, which means that time is of the essence. We will need to move as soon as the sun rises." He gestured to the torn bodies littering the platform. "We can't allow ourselves to rest the whole night anymore. We need to gather supplies now. If there was a chance, I would have liked to give these people at least a humble burial after gathering all that we can from them. But alas, fate has decided otherwise." Hero rose to his feet and brandished a sharp knife. Shifty tensed up and watched the blade carefully, but then relaxed, seeing that the young soldier showed no sign of aggression. "Food, water, warm clothes, firewood. That is what we need to find. Let us split up and accomplish one task each." Then he pointed at himself with the tip of the knife. "I will carve the oxen carcasses to get us some meat." Scholar looked around the stone platform, most of it drowning in deep shadows, and grimaced. "I'll look for firewood." Shifty also glanced left and right, with a strange gleam in his eyes. "Then I'll go find us something warm to wear." Sonny was the last one left. Hero gave him a long look. "Most of our water was stored on the wagon, but each of my fallen brothers was carrying a flagon. Gather as many as you can find." Sometime later, far enough from the bonfire to be hidden in the shadows, Sonny was looking for dead soldiers with half a dozen flagons already weighing him down. Shivering in the cold, he finally stumbled on the last broken body clad in leather armor. The old veteran, the one who had whipped him for trying to accept Hero's flask, was badly injured and dying, but miraculously still clinging to life. Horrible wounds were covering his chest and stomach, and he was clearly in a lot of pain. His time was running out. Sonny knelt beside the dying soldier and looked him over, searching for the man's flagon. What irony, he thought. The older man tried to focus his eyes on Sonny and weakly moved his hand, reaching for something. Sonny looked down and noticed a shattered sword lying on the ground not far from them. Curious, he picked it up. "Are you looking for this? Why? Are you guys like Vikings, longing to die with a weapon in your hands?" The dying soldier didn't answer, watching the young slave with some unknown, intense emotion in his eyes. Sonny sighed. "Well, it might as well do. After all, I promised to watch you die." With that, he leaned forward and slit the old man's throat with the sharp edge of his broken blade, then threw it away. The soldier twitched, drowning in his own blood. The expression in his eyes changed. Was it gratitude or hatred? Sonny did not know. Illusion or not, it was his first time killing a human. Sonny expected to feel guilt or fear, but actually there was nothing at all. It seemed that, for better or worse, his cruel upbringing in the real world had prepared him for this moment well. He sat quietly near the old man, keeping him company on this last journey. After a while, the spell's voice came whispering into his ear. "You have slain a dormant human, name unknown." Sonny flinched. "Oh, right. Killing people is also an achievement as far as the spell is concerned. They don't usually show this in webtoons and dramas." He registered that fact and put it away. But, as it turned out, the spell wasn't done speaking. "You have received a memory." Sonny froze, opening his eyes wide. "Yes, come on, give me something good." Memories could be anything, from weapons to enchanted items. One received from a dormant rank enemy wouldn't be too powerful, but it was still a boon. Weightless and undetectable, able to be summoned from nothingness with a simple thought. A memory was incredibly useful. What's more, unlike corporeal things, he would be able to bring it back with him to the real world. The advantage of having something like that back in the outskirts was hard to overestimate. A weapon! "Give me a sword." Received a memory, Silver Bell. Sonny sighed, disappointed. Well, with my luck, what was I expecting? Still, this thing was worth investigating. Maybe it had a powerful enchantment, like being able to send out destructive sonic waves or repelling incoming projectiles. Sonny summoned the runes and concentrated on the words Silver Bell. Immediately, an image of a small bell appeared in front of his eyes, with a short string of text below. "Silver Bell, a small memento of a long-lost home, which once brought its owner comfort and joy. Its clear ringing can be heard from miles away." What a piece of crap, Sonny thought, dejected. His first memory turned out to be pretty much useless, like everything else he possessed. He was almost starting to see a theme in how the spell was treating him. No matter, Sonny dismissed the runes and then got busy removing the dead man's fur cloak and warm, sturdy leather boots. As an officer, the quality of these clothes was a notch above those of the simple soldiers. After putting them on, the young slave finally felt warm for the first time since the nightmare began, not considering the short time he had spent near the bonfire. Perfect, he thought. The cloak was a bit bloodied, but then again, so was Sonny. He looked around, easily piercing the veil of darkness with his tenebrous eyes. Hero and Scholar were still in the middle of their tasks. Shifty was supposed to be looking for winter clothes, but was greedily pulling rings off the dead men's fingers instead. Unseen to them, Sonny hesitated, considering if he had really thought things through well. His companions were unreliable, the future was too uncertain. Even the requirements of passing the nightmare remained a mystery. Any decision he could make would have been a gamble at best. Still, he had to make some if he wanted to survive. Not wasting any more time thinking, Sonny picked up the flagons and sighed. They spent the rest of the night seating with their backs against the bonfire, staring fearfully into the night. Despite the exhaustion, no one could sleep. The possibility of the Tyrant coming back to finish the 4 survivors off was too frightening. Only Hero seemed to be fine, calmly sharpening his sword in the bright light of the dancing flames. The sound of the whetstones scraping against the blade was somehow comforting. At the break of dawn, when the sun had lazily begun to warm up the air, they loaded themselves with all the supplies they'd managed to gather and set out into the cold. Sonny looked back, taking in the sight of the stone platform for the last time. He had managed to get past the place where the slave caravan was supposed to perish. What was going to happen next? No one could tell. Chapter 9. Wishful thinking. There was a problem. They were planning to follow the road up to the mountain pass and then over it, getting as far away from the scene of the massacre as they could before the night came. However, the road was no more. At some point during the last months, or maybe even just yesterday, a terrible rockfall occurred, obliterating whole segments of the narrow roadway and making its other parts untraversable. Sonny stood on the precipice of a vast chasm, looking down with no particular expression on his face. "What do we do now?" Scholar's voice was muffled by the collar of his scavenged fur cloak. His follower, Shifty, angrily looked around. His gaze stopped at Sonny, a suitable victim to vent his frustration. "I'll tell you what we need to do. Get rid of some dead weight." He eyed Sonny's fine boots and turned to Hero. "Listen, your lordship. The boy is too weak. He is slowing us down. Plus, he's weird. Doesn't he give you the creeps?" The young soldier answered with a judgmental frown. But Shifty wasn't done. Look how he's glaring at me. I swear to gods, ever since he joined the caravan, nothing had gone right." Maybe the old man was right. The boy is cursed by the shadow god. Sonny struggled to not roll his eyes. It was true that he was unlucky. However, the whole truth was opposite to what Shifty was trying to insinuate. It was not that he had attracted misfortune to the slave caravan. On the contrary, it was because the caravan was doomed to begin with that he had ended up here. Scholar cleared his throat. "Ease the throat. But I've never said that." "Whatever. Shouldn't we get rid of him just in case? He can't go on for much longer anyway." Scholar gave Sonny a strange look. Perhaps Sonny was getting paranoid, but there seemed to be a bit of calculating coldness in the older slave's eyes. Finally, Scholar shook his head. "Don't be too hasty, my friend. The boy might prove useful later on." But Hero finally spoke, putting an end to their quarrel. "We're not going to leave anyone behind. As for how much longer he'll be able to endure, just worry about yourself." Shifty clenched his teeth but then just waved a hand. "Fine. So what do we do then?" The 4 of them looked at the broken road, then down the slope of the mountain, and finally up, where a sheer cliff wall was broken apart by the falling rocks. After a bit of silence, Scholar finally spoke. "Actually, in the old days, there used to be a path leading to the peak of the mountain. It was sometimes used by pilgrims. Later, the Empire had widened parts of the path and built a proper road on top of it, now leading to the mountain pass instead of the peak, of course." He looked up. "The remnants of the original path should still be somewhere above us. If we reach it, we should be able to find our way back to the undamaged section of the road." Everyone followed his gaze, shifting uncomfortably at the prospect of climbing the treacherous slope. Except for Hero, of course, who remained as calm as a saint. Due to the rockfall, the slope wasn't an almost vertical wall anymore. But still, the incline was quite sharp. Shifty was the first one to speak. "Climb that? Are you insane?" Scholar helplessly shrugged. "Do you have a better idea?" No one did. After a bit of preparation, they began the ascent. Shifty and Scholar stubbornly carried the weapons they had picked up off the dead soldiers' bodies, but Sonny, with some regret, decided to leave his newfound short sword behind. He knew that this climb was going to test the limits of their endurance. The sword might not have seemed to be that heavy right now, but every extra gram of weight was bound to feel like a ton all too soon. As the weakest member of the group, he was already struggling to keep up, so there wasn't a lot of choice. Shedding a few kilograms of iron was the right thing to do. Walking up the mountain road with the weight of the supplies on his shoulders was already hard enough, but climbing up the mountain itself turned out to be pure torture. Just half an hour later, he felt like his muscles were going to melt, with his lungs on the verge of imploding. Clenching his teeth, Sonny continued to move forward and up. He had to constantly remind himself to watch his footing too. On this unstable, icy slope, one misstep was enough to send a man tumbling down to his death. Just think about something pleasant, he thought. But what happy thoughts could he summon? Failing to come up with something else, Sonny began to imagine what reward he was going to receive at the end of this trial. The boon of the first nightmare was the most important thing given to an awakened by the spell. Sure, later trials could provide them with more abilities and vastly improve their power, but it was this first one that determined what role an awakened would be able to play, how great their potential would be, and what price they would have to pay. Not to mention giving them the necessary tools to survive and grow in the dream realm. The main benefit of the first nightmare's boon was simple, yet possibly the most important. After completing their trial, aspirants were bestowed with the ability to perceive and interact with soul cores. Soul cores were the basis of one's rank and power. The stronger your core was, the greater your might would grow. The same went for nightmare creatures, with a deadly caveat that, unlike humans, they could possess multiple cores. A lowly beast had just one, but a tyrant like Mountain King had 5. Coincidentally, the only way to improve your soul core was to consume soul shards scavenged from the corpses of other Dream Realm inhabitants. That's why Awakened went out of their way to battle powerful nightmare creatures despite the risk of death. The second benefit was less straightforward, but nevertheless vital. After completing the first nightmare, aspirants were elevated to the rank of dreamers, colloquially known as sleepers, and gained access to the dream realm itself. They would enter it on the first winter solstice after passing the trial and remain there until an exit was found, thus becoming fully awakened. That time between finishing the first nightmare and entering the dream realm was very important, as it was the last chance to train and prepare yourself a person would receive. In Sonny's case, that time was only about a month, which was as bad as it gets. And then there was the final benefit, unique to every aspirant passing the trial, the first aspect ability. This was the magic power that elevated Awakened above mundane humans. Aspect abilities were diverse, unique, and powerful. Some could be categorized into types, like combat, sorcery, and utility, but some were simply beyond imagination. Armed with the power of their abilities, Awakened had been able to save the world from the flood of nightmare creatures. However, that power came with a catch. With their first ability, every Awakened also received a flaw, sometimes called the counter. These flaws were as diverse as abilities, ranging from comparatively harmless to crippling, or, in some cases, even fatal. I wonder what type of ability a temple slave would get, Sonny thought, not too optimistic about his prospects. The choice of flaws, on the other hand, seems to be almost limitless. Let's hope my aspect will evolve at the end of this fiasco, or, even better, change completely. If the aspirant performed especially well, there was a chance of his given aspect going through an early evolution. Aspects, just like soul cores, had ranks based on potential power and rarity. The lowest rank was called dormant, followed by awakened, ascended, transcendent, supreme, sacred, and divine, although no one has ever seen the last one. With the amount of crap it had put me through, the spell, if it has any conscience, has to give me at least an awakened aspect, right? Or maybe even an ascended one. Finally, there was a tiny possibility of receiving a true name, something like an honorary title bestowed by the spell to its favorite awakened. The name itself had no benefit, but every famous awakened seemed to have one. It was considered to be the highest mark of excellence. However, the number of people who had managed to get a true name during their first nightmare was so small that Sunny didn't even bother thinking about it. "Who needs excellence? Give me power," he cursed, feeling that this attempt at wishful thinking had only made him more depressed and angry. Maybe I'm allergic to dreaming. An allergy like that would be truly ironic, considering that he was destined to spend half of his remaining life in the dream realm, if he even survives long enough to get there, that is. However, Sunny's mental escapade was not completely useless. Looking up from the slippery rocks under his feet, he noticed that the sun was already considerably lower. Come to think of it, the air also seemed to be much colder. At least it helped me pass the time, Sunny thought. The night was approaching. Chapter 10. First Man Down. By the time they decided to stop, Sunny was on the verge of fainting. After hours and hours of traversing the rough mountain slope, his body was almost at its limit. However, to everyone's surprise, Shifty seemed to be doing even worse than him. The roguish slave's eyes were muddy and unfocused, aimlessly wandering around. His breath was ragged and shallow, as though something was exerting pressure on his lungs. He looked feverish and unwell. As soon as Hero found a suitable place for a camp, Shifty simply collapsed on the ground. The most unnerving part about all of this was the lack of angry cursing that they had already gotten used to. The slave lay silent and motionless, with only movements of his chest betraying that he was still alive. Several moments later, he uncorked his flagon with a shaky hand and greedily drank a few large gulps. "Conserve your water," Hero said, a hint of concern somehow finding its way into his usually stoic voice. Disregarding these words, Shifty drank more, emptying the flagon completely. Scholar didn't look much better than him. The arduous climb took a heavy toll on the older slave. Despite the unbearable cold, he was sweaty, with bloodshot eyes and a grim expression on his face. Being the weakest of the three, Sunny had somehow managed to endure the best. "Can't we just melt the snow once there's no more water?" Hero gave Scholar a complicated look. "There might come a time when we won't be able to make a fire, as to not attract unwanted attention." No one commented, knowing perfectly well whose attention they had to avoid. The memory of Mountain King's horror was still fresh in their minds. Luckily, today Hero had managed to find a natural alcove in the mountain wall, perched precariously behind a narrow ledge. The fire was well hidden by the rocks, allowing them to enjoy its warmth without the fear of being noticed. No one was in the mood to talk, so they just roasted slices of oxen meat above the flames and ate in silence. By the time the skies had turned completely black, Shifty and Scholar were already asleep, lost in the thrall of their own nightmares. Hero took out his sword and moved to the edge of the rock outcropping. "Try to rest, as well. I'll take the first watch." Sunny gave him a nod and lay down near the fire, dead tired. Falling asleep inside a dream was a new experience for him, but unexpectedly, it turned out to be quite mundane. As soon as his head touched the ground, his consciousness slipped into darkness. After what felt like only a second, someone had gently shaken him awake. Groggy and disoriented, Sunny blinked a few times, finally noticing Hero hovering above him. These two didn't look too well, so it's better to give them some time to recover. Don't let the flames go out and wake us up once the sun starts to rise. Or if if the beast appears. Sunny silently rose and changed places with Hero, who added a couple of logs into the fire and was soon fast asleep. For a few hours he was on his own. The skies were black, with dim stars and a sharp crescent of the newborn moon. However, its light was not enough to pierce the darkness that enveloped the mountain. Only Sunny's eyes seemed to be able to do so. He sat quietly, looking down the way they came. Despite the fact that they had managed to climb quite high during the previous day, he could still see the distant ribbon of the road. He could even trace it back to the stone platform where the fight with the Tyrant had taken place. The tiny dots littering the stones were the dead bodies of the slaves. As he was watching them, a dark figure slowly crawled on the platform from beneath the cliff. It stayed motionless for a while and then moved forward, scraping its claws against the ground. Every time a claw hit one of the bodies, the Tyrant would grab and bring it to its maw. The wind brought the muffled sounds of crunching bones to Sunny's ears. He flinched, accidentally pushing a small rock off the ledge. It fell, hit the slope, and then rolled down, causing a few more to follow. The noise of these falling rocks sounded like thunder in the silent night. Far below, the Tyrant suddenly turned its head, looking directly at Sunny. Sunny froze, petrified. He was scared to make even the tiniest sound. For a while, he even forgot to breathe. The Tyrant was staring directly at him, not doing anything. A few torturous seconds passed, each feeling like an eternity. Then the Tyrant calmly turned away and continued to devour dead slaves, as though he had not seen Sunny at all. "It's blind," Sunny suddenly understood. He inhaled, watching Mountain King with widened eyes. It was true. The creature could not see. Looking back at everything that had happened earlier, he grew more and more certain of his guess. Those milky, expressionless eyes. Come to think of it, he never saw the Tyrant moving them at all. And back when Sunny was pushing the wagon off the cliff, the Tyrant only reacted after the wagons had started to fall, scraping loudly against the rocks. Of course, it was all making sense now. At the break of dawn, Sunny had woken the others up. Hero had hoped that a full night's rest would do Shifty and Scholar some good, but his hopes were crushed. Somehow, the two slaves looked even worse than before. It was as though yesterday's climb had overstrained Scholar too much. However, Shifty's condition could not be explained by simple overexertion. He was deadly pale and shaky, with half-conscious eyes and a lost look on his face. "What's wrong with him?" Scholar, who himself was not doing very well, helplessly shook his head. "It might be the mountain sickness. It affects different people differently." His voice sounded raspy and weak. "I'm fine, assholes. Get out of my face." Shifty had trouble forming full sentences, but still insisted that he was all right. Hero frowned and then took most of the supplies the defiant slave was supposed to carry before adding them to his own load. After hesitating a little, he gave some to Sunny too. "Did anything happen while we were asleep?" Sunny stared at him for a few seconds. "The monster ate the dead." The young soldier's frown deepened. "How do you know?" "I heard it." Hero moved to the edge and looked down, trying to make out the distant stone platform. After a minute or so, he clenched his jaw, showing signs of uncertainty for the first time. "Then we'll have to move faster. If the creature is finished with all the bodies, it will come for us next. We need to find that old path before nightfall." Frightened and dejected, they set out again and continued to climb. Sunny was slowly dying under the weight of the added load. Thankfully, Shifty and Scholar had already drunk most of the water, lightening it a little. "This is hell," he thought. They climbed higher and higher and higher. The sun was climbing with them, slowly approaching the zenith. There was no talking, no laughs, only strained breathing. Each of the 4 survivors was concentrated on his own steps and footing. However, Shifty was falling farther and farther behind. His strength was abandoning him. And then, at some point, Sunny heard a desperate scream. Turning around, he only had time to see a panic-stricken face. Then Shifty fell backward, his foot slipping on an ice-covered rock. He hit the ground hard and rolled down, still trying to grab onto something. But it was too late. Frozen in place and powerless, they could only watch as his body tumbled down the slope, leaving bloody marks on the rocks. With each second, Shifty looked less like a man and more like a rag doll. A handful of moments later, he finally came to a halt, hitting the top of a large, protruding stone in a pile of broken flesh. Shifty was dead.